Hello everyone, and thank you very much again for attending this session. I want to dive right into the topic of privacy by first zooming out a bit and sketching the process of location data collection and the market that we have for that data. So a broad sketch of the location data market could be something as follows. We have an individual with a location-enabled device, something like a smartphone, that agrees to have their location tracked by a company in exchange for a service, usually through something like an app. And the information, location information will be gathered by that app, and the device is hardware, and that will be sent to a third company, which is an aggregator, that aggregates that location data. That aggregator can then pass that location data back to the app, which provides a service, something like your directions, and we can call this exchange the initial transaction. This transaction is usually bound by non-disclosure agreements as well. In addition to this initial transaction, though, we have a secondary market where the aggregators sell that data to third-party purchasers in the secondary market. And once purchased, these third-party companies who have no direct relationship to the original individual that provided the location data will then combine that location data with other forms of data like purchasing histories and preferences to create profiles and predictions that can be sold to other companies or public agencies. And I believe that kind of outlining this location data market is an important first step for our conversation because we need to recognize that the incentives in this market do not align with ensuring individual privacy. The advertising models that use location data are more predictive of behavior and more powerful if they have greater quantity of data and a greater variety of data. And this reality creates economies of scale and economies of scope that incentivize the collection of more and more location data. And if we don't plan for this market dynamic and put measures in place to address it, these incentives are likely to exist with location data related to COVID-19 as well. The exchange of location data sketched out in this market is regulated to some extent. However, current regulations and protections are really limited, particularly in the secondary location data market, which is not robustly addressed by U.S. law. Without exploring all the literature in a lot of detail, the notice and consent model really captures the privacy principles behind this regulation. So that notice and consent model of privacy essentially requires that an organization clearly inform an individual how their location data will be processed, shared, and used, and the organization to really only collect that data once valid consent is obtained from that informed individual, or that individual has failed to opt out. And these two overarching principles are elaborated in many details in a set of principles of spatial data handling proposed by Ansrund in 1994. And the same principles inform the GIS Code of Ethics, which I've listed here, which essentially states that it's a GIS professional's duty to allow individuals to withhold consent from being added to a database, correct information about themselves in a database, and remove themselves from any kind of database. And in the last few years, people have been recognizing that these principles are not really being applied in many cases, especially in that secondary data market. And we've seen a move to increase formal regulation of location data, particularly at the state level. Now, why are these details about location data and the market important here as we sit and discuss COVID-19? Well, first, as a practical matter, this is the environment our contact tracing systems will operate in, unless we actively design ways to isolate COVID-19 related location information from this environment or change the environment entirely. Second, the contact tracing systems we create will relate to privacy in different ways depending on the purpose we want them to serve. So a contact tracing system designed to automatically identify potentially infected individuals raises different privacy challenges than a system designed to trace and notify individuals, or a system designed to enforce movement restrictions. And then third, I would say also, in the midst of the pandemic, we are all rightly looking for solutions to save and improve people's lives. But in this situation, there may be good reason to temporarily compromise on privacy principles. However, we also need to think about how we want to return to the principles we found important before the pandemic by designing systems that sunset as the pandemic subsides. So given my limited time, we can't talk about all these different models and purposes, but I want to examine one purpose of contact tracing systems included in really all reopening plans that I'm aware of at this time. And that's using location data to assist in tracing where a COVID-19 positive individual was in the recent past, who they may have come into contact with, so we can then alert those who've been potentially exposed to that individual. So let's call this objective a trace and alert objective for short. And really there are three framing questions, I think, related to privacy related to this objective. So first of all, how would a trace and alert system operate within the current location environment? Which privacy principles are we relaxing when we implement a trace and alert system? And what measures can we put in place to potentially limit the impacts on privacy and facilitate a return to privacy principles as this pandemic subsides and ends? So I'm going to further narrow this scope slightly here and use the South Korean trace and alert system as the basis for discussion, because experts and media have identified this system as the current best practice model. So how does this system work? Well, if we return to our ecosystem diagram and focus on that initial transaction, what the Korean system is doing is really linking two transactions. In addition to the normal exchange of location data between individuals and service providers that we outlined before, we have a second transaction between individuals and those administering COVID-19 testing. For simplicity, let's call the parties administering COVID-19 testing the government. So within the Korean system, the individual receives the result of a COVID-19 test and understands that if the test is positive, it triggers a second set of actions by government that links the positive test data to location data. So specifically what happens is, under legislation passed in the wake of the MERS outbreak, the Korean government will gather recent location data about the individual, and after removing information that would make the individual easily identifiable, post recent location history of that individual on official government websites and social media accounts, and contact people who may have come into contact with that infected individual. The Korean data is released with the first four letters of your surname and information about your age, gender, and nationality, to help people identify if they may have come in contact with that person. The Korean publicly regularly checks these data sites to see about COVID-19 positive cases, and if they're concerned about potentially being exposed, they can access testing. So if we implement this system in the United States, what are some potential challenges to privacy? Well, first of all, the Korean alert system effectively moves the notice part of notice and consent into the overarching legislation, and also suspends consent during the pandemic. If we implement a similar tracing system in the US, we should clearly identify the conditions under which this kind of system will enter into effect and how the system is phased out as the pandemic subsides and return to our prior privacy rights and principles. Second, we can see how releasing location histories would lead to identification. Even if we were to remove the surname information in the US-based system, in many cases location data about an individual is enough to re-identify that individual. So research suggests that as few as 4 points of high-resolution spatial temporal data are enough to identify 95% of individuals in some samples, and aggregating data is really best a partial solution to this problem. If you know the census blocks where someone lives and the census blocks where someone works, you can uniquely identify about 50% of the US population. A partial way around this issue would be to trace individuals in relational space, or where they are in relation to other people, and not in absolute space where they are in the world. So for example, the Google and Apple trace and alert systems that are being proposed exchange Bluetooth keys that are encrypted. And in this way, as people pass each other, we can create a record of who's been near whom. And this may help with some of these re-identification issues, but raise other problems. And then really third, I would say, re-identification is only one part of the larger challenge of privacy. So any contact tracing system designed for a similar purpose would raise questions about how we store, share, and use this data. And specifically, people should be notified how their data is being used, shared, or augmented, and if any of those things change as well. So if we think about to preserving privacy as much as possible in this trace and alert systems, I suggest we think about a couple of design principles organized around points where we're collecting the data and points where we're transferring the data. So at points of collection, I think we really want to have location data collection be as limited as possible to the trace and alert objective. So government and companies should only collect location data relevant to COVID-19 response and for the time period relevant to the trace and alert objective. Similarly, we should restrict companies from aggregating location data or providing location data to government agencies from obtaining a long-term database of infected individuals. Similarly, government and companies should only use data for the purposes of pandemic response, and those things should be clearly articulated to people, how we're going to store data and things like this. And then data collection should anticipate that some groups are going to be undersampled and selected groups and technologies are going to have different limitations, which will create different challenges or privacy concerns in different places. So if you take the simplest case of the urban-rural divide, where simple differences in settlement density and infrastructure are going to impact technology performance and how easily it is to identify individuals. And then at points of transfer, I think what we want to do is we want to limit the transfer of COVID-19 related location data as much as possible. So close the transfer of any COVID-19 related data to the secondary market where regulations do not exist. Limit the adoption of the addition of other forms of data about individuals to COVID-19 data to purposes related to the pandemic and the trace and alert objective. We don't want to be building just big databases of people's data. And we want to seriously consider the trade-off of sharing location data publicly, recognizing that re-identification is very possible in a lot of cases. And then finally, kind of overall here, we just want to kind of try to preserve notice of consent as much as possible. So we can give clear notice that we're going to collect location data. We can notify people what data is going to be collected, how it's going to be stored, how it'll be transferred. And we can notify people when those things change. And we can create clear plans to run down this system, to sunset this system as the pandemic subsides. So thank you very much.